This HOA Karen called 911 on my 74-year-old grandpa just for moving into his own lake cabin. Before I knew it, 2 police cars were rolling up his private drive, and Karen was standing there, waving faked documents and demanding they arrest my grandfather for squatting. She thought she had him trapped, claiming his cabin was an environmental hazard on HOA land. But she had no idea who she was messing with. When the senior officer saw my grandpa's old Vietnam service patch, he didn't pull out handcuffs. He saluted him. Instead, what would you do if a power-hungry neighbor tried to use the police to steal your family's property? Drop a comment below about where you are watching from, because the story of how my grandpa got his revenge is just getting started. It all started on a Tuesday morning. The clock in my grandfather's cabin read 8:17 a.m. when he found the letter. My grandpa, Harold, is 74 years old. He's a retired master electrician, but more than that, he's a Vietnam vet who values his quiet. He bought this place, 12 acres of trees and water, to live out his days in peace. The property line sits a good quarter-mile outside the jurisdiction of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, a fact recorded in triplicate down at the county courthouse. But facts didn't seem to matter to the person who'd taped a notice of violation to his freshly painted front door. The notice itself was a work of passive-aggressive art. At the top, in big, bold letters, it claimed he was in violation of 2 separate HOA bylaws. The first was for unauthorized occupancy. He'd only been living in the cabin he'd spent the last year restoring for 3 weeks. The second was for creating an environmental hazard, a vague and baseless accusation aimed at his new, state-of-the-art septic system. But the worst part was the stamp at the bottom. A smear of red ink, pressed so hard it bled through the paper, formed the words, "Final Warning." It was a threat, plain and simple, designed to scare someone into submission. Harold, however, doesn't scare easily. He peeled the notice off the door, folded it neatly, and placed it on the passenger seat of his old Ford truck. He drove into town, not to the HOA office, but to his favorite diner for coffee. That's where he called me. I'm his grandson, Jake, a freelance videographer. I'd been living with him for the past month, helping with the move and documenting the cabin's transformation. When he told me about the letter, I knew this was more than just a paperwork mix-up. "I'll be right there," I told him, grabbing my camera bag on the way out the door. We met at the diner, and over a plate of bacon and eggs, he laid the notice on the table. The paper was cheap. The HOA logo at the top slightly pixelated, like it had been copied and pasted from a website. I took out my phone and started my own documentation. I took high-resolution photos of the letter from every angle. I logged the date and time. Tuesday, summer, 8:57 a.m. Every detail, no matter how small, could be important later. My grandfather, ever the practical one, just shook his head. "Some people have too much time on their hands," he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He had looked forward to a quiet retirement, not a fight with a faceless bureaucracy. Our first glimmer of hope came, ironically, from the source of the problem. On our way out of town, we stopped at the local general store for supplies. And there she was, Karen Driscoll, the HOA's compliance chair. She was a woman in her early 50s, dressed in crisp linen pants and a polo shirt with the same pixelated HOA logo embroidered on the chest. She greeted us with a smile so wide it looked painful. "Harold, so good to see you settling in," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. My grandfather, always courteous, simply nodded. I, on the other hand, held up the notice. "We had a question about this," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Karen glanced at the letter and let out a little laugh. "Oh, that! Don't you worry about that one bit. It's just a mix-up, a clerical error. We're updating our records, and sometimes these things get sent out by mistake. I'll take care of it personally." She patted my grandfather's arm. A gesture that was supposed to be reassuring, but felt more like a warning. For a moment, we were relieved. Maybe it really was just a mistake. Maybe Karen was just an overzealous volunteer trying to do her job. That hope lasted until about 10 p.m. that night. I was in my room, editing some footage from earlier in the day, when I heard a noise outside. It was a twig snapping, loud and clear in the night silence. I turned off my light and crept to the window, which overlooked the side yard. And that's when I saw her. It was Karen. She was dressed in dark clothing, pacing back and forth at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of our porch light. She held a flashlight, its beam cutting sharp, nervous circles in the darkness, scanning the property. She raised her phone and snapped a photo of the cabin. The flash, a brilliant, intrusive burst of light. Then another, this time aimed at my grandfather's bedroom window. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a mix-up. This was an invasion. This was deliberate. I grabbed my camera, switched it to night vision, and started recording. I zoomed in on her face, contorted in a mask of grim determination. She was muttering to herself, pacing like a caged animal. Then she stopped, put her phone to her ear, and started talking. The sound was muffled by the distance, but the wind carried her final words across the yard with chilling clarity. "He's here now," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. "And I'll make sure they handle it." Handle it? Handle him? A deep sense of dread settled in my stomach. This was no longer about a piece of paper. This was a declaration of war, and we had no idea who they were. The night after Karen's prowling expedition was tense. I copied the video file from my camera to my laptop and then to a separate hard drive. 2 copies, plus the original on the SD card. You can't be too careful. We didn't know what she meant by they, but we knew we had to be ready. That readiness was put to the test sooner than we expected. The confrontation didn't happen in the dead of night, as we'd feared. It came on a brilliant Saturday morning. The clock on the stove read 6:42 a.m. My grandfather was already down at the end of his small wooden dock, a place he called his church. He had 2 fishing rods out, their lines still as glass on the water's surface. A white ceramic mug of coffee steamed next to him. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. This was his sanctuary. It was the very picture of peace. And then, that peace was shattered. It started as a faint whine, a sound that didn't belong in the woods. The whine grew into a wail, bouncing off the trees and echoing across the lake. Police sirens. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my phone and rushed to the front window. 2 county sheriff's patrol cars were rolling down my grandpa's long gravel driveway, their blue and red lights flashing silently, painting the trees in strobing bursts of color. By the time I got outside, the cars had parked, and waiting for them, standing at the edge of the lawn with her arms crossed, was Karen Driscoll. She was wearing a brightly colored tracksuit, a weekend warrior reporting for duty. She immediately strode over to the first officer who stepped out of his car, a young deputy who looked barely old enough to shave. Karen waved a sheaf of papers in his face, her voice high and urgent. "Thank you for coming so quickly, officer," she said, loud enough for me and my grandfather, who was now walking up from the dock, to hear clearly. "This man," she said, pointing a dramatic finger at Harold, "is squatting on HOA property. He has no right to be here." The young deputy looked from Karen to my grandfather, his expression a mixture of confusion and caution. A second officer, older and with a tired, seen-it-all look on his face, got out of the other car and walked over. Karen's voice grew louder, more theatrical. "Furthermore," she declared, "he is stealing lake resources. The water in that lake belongs to the members of Lakeside Estates, and his unauthorized presence is a clear violation." Stealing the lake. It was so absurd it was almost funny. But nobody was laughing. My grandfather reached us, his face calm but his eyes hard. He didn't even look at Karen. He addressed the older officer. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I'm Harold Whitaker. This is my property." Karen scoffed. "He's a liar. He has no proof. I have the official HOA violation forms right here." She thrust the papers toward the officer. The senior officer took them, his eyes scanning the poorly printed pages. He looked at my grandfather. "Sir, do you have any documentation proving ownership?" he asked. My grandpa nodded slowly. "I do," he said. "Jake, would you mind?" I ran back inside the cabin and returned with a heavy manila envelope. My grandfather took it, and with the deliberate care of a man who respects official documents, he pulled out 3 things. First, he unfolded the land deed, its edges crisp, the county seal clearly visible at the bottom. He handed it to the officer. Next, he produced the tax receipts for the last 5 years, each one stamped PAID. Finally, he pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was an old Army commendation, a piece of his history he rarely showed anyone. He held it in his hand but didn't offer it up. The senior officer studied the deed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The younger deputy, meanwhile, seemed to be getting impatient with Karen. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have a specific parcel ID for this property that matches the HOA's jurisdiction map?" Karen's confident smirk wavered. "Well, it's in the system. The address is clearly a violation," she sputtered, waving her hands vaguely. All this time, I had my phone up, recording every word, every gesture. I made sure the screen showed the date and time in a small overlay in the corner. This was our proof. Karen saw me filming, and her face turned crimson. The situation was slipping from her grasp. She turned her fury back on my grandfather. "He's refusing to cooperate. He is resisting compliance. I demand you place him in handcuffs right now." That was when the senior officer finished reading the deed. He folded it carefully and handed it back to my grandfather. His eyes, however, weren't on the paper. They were fixed on the old army patch sewn onto my grandfather's fishing vest, the faded insignia of the Honest Cavalry Division. The officer's entire demeanor changed. His tired posture snapped straight. He stood taller, his shoulders squared. He took a sharp step forward, not with aggression, but with a profound sense of respect. He looked my grandfather directly in the eye, and in the quiet of that Saturday morning, with Karen still demanding an arrest, the officer raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, formal salute. The salute hung in the air for a long moment, a silent gesture that completely changed the gravity of the situation. Karen Driscoll's jaw went slack. Her carefully constructed drama of victimhood and authority collapsed in an instant. My grandfather, Harold, a man who rarely shows emotion, gave a short, sharp nod in return. It was an acknowledgement between two men who understood a certain kind of world, a world where respect was earned, not demanded. The younger deputy, Henson, looked back and forth between his partner and my grandfather, his confusion slowly turning into dawning understanding. He wasn't just dealing with an old man in a fishing vest. He was in the presence of someone his superior held in high regard. The tension that had crackled in the air just minutes before evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. It was a quiet, unshakable calm. Karen was left standing there, her bogus violation papers hanging limply from her hand, suddenly irrelevant. By 11:30 that morning, the scene in my grandfather's driveway looked less like a police call and more like an old-timers' coffee meeting. The senior officer, Sheriff Tom Callahan, had sent the younger deputy back to his car. Callahan himself was now sitting in one of the Adirondack chairs on the lawn, a mug of my grandfather's strong black coffee in his hand. He and Harold were talking, not about property lines or HOA rules, but about their time in the service. It turned out Sheriff Callahan had also served in the 1st Cavalry Division, albeit decades after my grandfather. But the connection was there, a shared history that bonded them instantly. Callahan mentioned he knew of Harold even before seeing the patch. "You're the electrician who rewired the volunteer fire station down in town, aren't you?" he asked. My grandfather confirmed that he was. He'd done the work for free, a small way of giving back to the community he had chosen for his retirement. While they talked, Karen paced near her car like a trapped animal. She had her phone pressed to her ear again, her voice a low, furious whisper. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. The authority she had tried to borrow from the sheriff's department had been turned against her. She was no longer the one in control, and she couldn't stand it. Sheriff Callahan eventually turned his attention back to the matter at hand. He gestured toward Karen. "Ma'am, I'd like to take another look at those violation forms, if you don't mind," he said, his voice polite but firm. Karen flinched, as if the papers themselves were now toxic. She reluctantly walked over and handed them to him. Callahan laid the documents out on the small table between the chairs. In the full light of day, they looked even more amateurish. The ink was uneven, and the whole page was slightly tilted, a classic sign of a bad scanner job. Callahan handed one of the pages to Deputy Henson. "Check these dates for me, son," he said. The deputy read the alleged violations aloud. Notice of unauthorized occupancy, dated June 12th. Notice of environmental hazard, dated June 18th. I felt a jolt of recognition. I pulled out my phone and flipped back through my photos, the ones I had taken documenting my grandpa's renovation project. "Sheriff," I said, stepping forward, "my grandpa didn't even move in until July 5th. I have time-stamped photos of the moving truck arriving." I showed him the photo on my phone. The date was clearly visible in the corner. 7/5. The violations Karen was claiming had supposedly happened 3 weeks before my grandfather was even living there. Karen's face went white. She had been caught in a simple, undeniable lie. She snatched the papers from the deputy's hand. "This is a waste of time," she hissed. "You're clearly biased. I am a representative of the Homeowners Association, and I will be taking this matter to the county. You haven't heard the last of this." She spun on her heel, marched to her car, and sped away, kicking up a plume of gravel behind her. A heavy silence settled over the driveway. Sheriff Callahan shook his head slowly. "Well," he said, "that was something." He picked up the single page Karen had dropped in her haste, the original final warning notice she had taped to the door. He handed it to me. "You'll want to hold on to this, son. I have a feeling it might be important." As he stood up to leave, I looked closely at the paper in my hand. My eyes drifted to the HOA seal at the top. Something about it was wrong. I raised my camera and zoomed in, focusing the lens until the image was crystal clear. The eagle in the center was blurry, its edges pixelated. The circle around it wasn't a perfect circle. It was slightly warped, crooked. It was a fake, a cheap, scanned copy of a real seal. I lowered the camera and whispered to myself, the words caught by my phone's microphone, "A permanent record of the moment everything changed. That's not the real one." The encounter with Sheriff Callahan left us with a sense of cautious victory. But that crooked, pixelated seal on Karen's violation notice told me the fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The sheriff had validated my grandfather's right to be there, but he hadn't erased the threat. Karen was still out there, stewing in her own defeat. And people like her don't just walk away, they double down. So, during the second week of this bizarre siege, we decided to go on the offensive. My grandfather focused on what he did best, methodically checking and rechecking every system in his cabin, ensuring it was perfect. My job was to dismantle Karen's story, piece by piece, using nothing but public records and a bit of digital legwork. My first stop was the county clerk's office, a quiet, dusty building in the center of town. I went in with a simple goal: to find any official record that connected my grandfather's property to the Lakeside Estates HOA. I spent 2 hours with a helpful clerk who showed me how to use their public terminals. We pulled up every document associated with Harold's 12-acre parcel. The deed was there, clean and clear. The tax records were perfect. But when we searched for any HOA liens, violations, or jurisdictional agreements, we found nothing. It was a digital ghost. There was absolutely no legal tether between my grandfather's land and Karen Driscoll's petty kingdom. The clerk even printed out a certified copy of the county's official GIS parcel map, which showed Harold's property line ending a full quarter-mile before the HOA's designated boundary began. It was concrete, undeniable proof. Armed with that map, I returned to the cabin and began my step-by-step demolition of Karen's claims. First, I compared the official county map with a promotional map I found on the Lakeside Estates public website. Side by side on my screen, the difference was obvious. My grandfather's land wasn't just outside their border. It was in a completely different plat section. Next, I took the violation numbers from her forged notices. I called the main phone number for the Lakeside Estates Management Company, pretending to be a homeowner wanting to check on a violation status. I read the numbers from Karen's letter. The woman on the other end was confused. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but those numbers don't match our system's format. Are you sure you're reading them correctly?" The numbers were completely made up. The most damning part of the puzzle, however, was the signature. Karen had scribbled a looping, authoritative-looking signature at the bottom of the notices, next to the title, HOA President. Back at the county clerk's office, I had found public filings for the HOA, documents that had to be signed by the actual board chair. The real president was a man named Paul Redmond, and his signature, available for anyone to see, was a tight, clipped autograph that looked nothing like the scrawl on our notices. This led to the most important discovery of all. Karen Driscoll wasn't the HOA president. She wasn't even on the board of directors. A quick search of the HOA's own online directory revealed her true title, Compliance Chair. It was a volunteer position. Her only official power was to walk the neighborhood, note if someone's grass was too long, and then report it to the real board, who would then decide whether to issue a formal letter. She had no enforcement power, no legal authority. She couldn't file violations, levy fines, or call the sheriff with any more authority than any other citizen. She was playing a character, dressing up in a costume of power she hadn't earned and didn't possess. With all this evidence compiled, the map comparison, the non-existent violation numbers, the signature forgery, and her real, powerless title, I drafted an email. It was polite, professional, and full of facts. I addressed it to Paul Redmond and the other 2 members of the official HOA board. I laid out the timeline of events, from the first notice to the visit from the sheriff. I attached every piece of evidence as a separate file: high-resolution photos of the fraudulent notices, the video of Karen trespassing on our property, a screenshot of the official county map, and a link to their own public directory showing Karen's actual title. I ended the email with a simple, direct question: "Can you please confirm if these actions were authorized by the board of the Lakeside Estates, HOA?" The response came faster than I expected, not from the whole board, but from 2 of the members separately. They replied quietly, their emails sent late at night, as if they didn't want anyone looking over their shoulder. The first wrote, "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for bringing this to our attention. To be clear, the board did not authorize any of these communications or actions." The second was even more direct. "This is completely unsanctioned. Karen Driscoll does not have the authority to represent the board in this capacity. We will be looking into this internally." It was a total vindication. We had proven our case. We had exposed her lies. But just as a wave of relief washed over us, the war escalated. My grandfather, checking the mail, found a different kind of letter. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the State Department of Natural Resources. Karen, having failed to win, with her fake local authority, had gone over our heads. She had filed an official emergency environmental hazard complaint with the state. The letter informed us that an inspector would be arriving to investigate a serious allegation that my grandfather's cabin was leaking raw sewage directly into the lake. It was a vicious, dangerous lie, one that could not only cost him thousands in fines, but could get his beautiful, handcrafted cabin condemned. The game had changed. This was no longer a squabble with a petty tyrant. This was a battle against a state agency, all because of one woman's desperate, vengeful obsession. The letter from the Department of Natural Resources felt different. Karen's forged HOA notices were an annoyance, a personal vendetta wrapped in cheap printer paper. This was official. This involved the state. Her accusation that my 74-year-old grandfather's meticulously built cabin was leaking raw sewage into the lake was not just a lie. It was a tactical escalation. It was designed to bury us in fines, red tape, and public shame. The inspection was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Sheriff Callahan's visit. My grandfather, Harold, was surprisingly calm. While I spent my time anxiously researching state environmental codes, he spent his cleaning his tools. To him, this wasn't a legal battle. It was a challenge to his craftsmanship, and that was a battle he knew how to win. The inspector arrived at 10:00 a.m. sharp. He was a man named Doug Mercer, about 50 years old, with a sun-weathered face and a direct, no-nonsense air about him. He carried a clipboard and a heavy-duty case full of testing equipment. He wasn't here for drama. He was here for data. My grandfather met him on the porch with a handshake. "Harold Whitaker," he said. "Glad you could make it." Harold led Mr. Mercer around to the side of the cabin where the septic system was located. There was no foul smell. There were no damp patches of earth. There was only a neatly manicured patch of grass with 3 green access covers set flush with the ground. "This is it," Harold said, a note of pride in his voice. He wasn't just showing an inspector a septic tank. He was presenting his work. He handed Mercer a folder. Inside were the original blueprints for the system, the permits he had pulled from the county before a single shovelful of dirt was moved, and his own master electrician's certification, notarized and dated. Mercer took the folder and reviewed the documents silently, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. "All right, Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Let's take a look." For the next hour, Mercer conducted his inspection with quiet efficiency. He opened the access ports, took samples, and measured flow rates. My grandfather stood by, answering every question with precise, technical detail. He explained the dual leach field design he had implemented, a system that went far beyond the minimum state requirements. He pointed out the high-level alarm he had wired in, a failsafe that wasn't even mentioned in the county code. I stood back, my phone recording the entire process. I wanted a clear, unambiguous record of this inspection. At one point, I captured Mercer, looking up from his instruments. "Looks fine to me," he said, more to himself than to us. He explained that the official test results would be processed at the state lab and would become public record in 3 days, but that he saw no visual evidence of any failure. It was in that moment of relief, of course, that she appeared. A car door slammed shut up by the road, and we all turned to see Karen Driscoll marching down the driveway. She had clearly been waiting for the inspector to arrive. She bypassed us completely and went straight for Mercer, her face a mask of frantic concern. "Inspector, thank God I caught you," she said, her voice breathy and urgent. "You have to understand. You can't trust what he shows you. He's not a licensed contractor." Mercer looked at her, then back at his clipboard, his expression one of weary patience. "Ma'am, the property owner is allowed to install his own systems as long as they pass a certified inspection," he stated flatly. "And this man," my grandfather added calmly, tapping the folder Mercer was holding, "is a certified master electrician who got every permit and passed every inspection." Karen, ignored him. Her eyes were wide, her hands gesturing wildly. "But that's the point. You can't trust him, he built it himself," she shouted, as if this were the most damning accusation imaginable. The words hung in the air for a beat. The inspector, Doug Mercer, slowly raised his head. He looked directly at Karen, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed his professional face. Annoyance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative calm. "That's exactly why it's better than code." Karen froze. The logic of his statement was like a slap in the face. She had no response. Her entire argument that a craftsman's personal involvement was a weakness had been turned inside out, exposing her own ignorance. Mercer closed his sample case with a decisive snap. "My preliminary findings show a system that exceeds state and county requirements. The official report will be available Friday. Have a good day." He gave a nod to my grandfather, completely dismissed Karen, and walked back to his state-issued truck. Karen stood motionless on the lawn, utterly defeated. She had fired her biggest cannon, and it had turned out to be a dud. She finally stormed off without another word, the sound of her car engine screaming in frustration as she peeled away. We had won. The state itself had validated my grandfather's work and exposed Karen's complaint as baseless. That night, a sense of deep peace settled over the cabin. But peace, we were learning, was a temporary condition. Around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the security app I'd set up. "Motion detected at mailbox." I opened the app and watched the live feed from the small, camouflaged camera I had mounted on a tree aimed at our mailbox down by the road. There, bathed in the camera's infrared light, was a figure. It was Karen. She was furtively looking back towards the dark road. Then she turned to the mailbox. Her hands, covered in what looked like blue disposable gloves, went to the small metal door. She wasn't just looking in it. She was prying it open. She pulled out the contents, shuffled through them quickly under the light of her phone, and then stuffed them into her jacket pocket. I hit the record button, my heart pounding. This was no longer harassment. Tampering with U.S. mail is a federal crime. She had just crossed a line from which there was no coming back. The video footage of Karen Driscoll at our mailbox was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the digital equivalent of catching a thief with their hand in the cookie jar. This wasn't a he said, she said dispute over property lines anymore. This wasn't a matter of interpreting HOA bylaws. This was a clear, unambiguous federal crime caught on camera. My first step, even before I told my grandfather, was to secure the evidence. I downloaded the original video file from the security camera's cloud server. I saved a copy to my laptop's encrypted hard drive, and another to a new, dedicated flash drive. I made a third copy and stored it on a separate cloud service under a different account. I learned a long time ago that evidence only matters if you can't lose it. Once the files were secure, I went frame by frame through the video, taking high-quality still images. I captured the moment Karen looked over her shoulder, the clear shot of her using her phone as a flashlight, and the exact moment her gloved hands pried open the mailbox door. I compiled these images, each with a timestamp burned into the corner, into a single PDF document. Proof. The next morning, I showed my grandfather the video. He watched it once, his face grim, and didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly, put on his jacket, and walked down to the end of the driveway. I followed him. There, on the ground just a few feet from the mailbox post, was a torn piece of junk mail, an advertisement for a local grocery store. Karen, in her haste, must have ripped it open, realized it was nothing important, and tossed it aside. My grandfather, using 2 twigs as pincers, carefully picked up the torn envelope fragments and placed them into a clean plastic sandwich bag. "Fingerprints," was all he said. He understood that digital evidence is powerful, but physical evidence is timeless. Back inside, it was time to close the loop. I drafted a new email. The recipient list was small: Sheriff Tom Callahan and Paul Redmond, the actual HOA board chair. The subject line was simple: evidence of mail tampering at Harold's address. The body of the email was short and factual. I stated that our security camera had recorded an individual tampering with and stealing U.S. mail from our locked mailbox at 11:03 p.m. the previous night. I attached the PDF of time-stamped photos and a compressed, password-protected file of the video itself. I ended the email by stating that we had preserved the original evidence and were prepared to deliver it to the sheriff's department upon request. The first call came less than an hour later. It was Sheriff Callahan. His friendly, off-duty tone was gone. He was all business. "Jake, Tom Callahan here. I received your email," he said, his voice clipped and serious. "I need you to know that tampering with a mailbox is a federal offense. This has now moved beyond a simple harassment complaint." He asked if we had touched anything, and I told him about the envelope fragments my grandfather had collected. "Good," he said. "Don't touch it again. Can you and your grandfather come down to my office this afternoon? Bring the flash drive with the original video file, and bring those envelope fragments." The second call came an hour after that. It was from a private number. The man on the other end sounded exhausted. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Paul Redmond, the HOA board chair." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I got your email. I am so sorry. We had no idea it had gone this far." He confessed that the board had received other, minor complaints about Karen Driscoll using HOA letterhead for personal disputes. "She has a history of these personal grudges," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But forgery? Mail theft? The board has already voted in an emergency session this morning. As of 10:00 a.m., Karen Driscoll has been permanently removed from her position as compliance chair, and her membership in the association is under formal review. She does not represent us, period." That afternoon, my grandfather and I sat across the desk from Sheriff Callahan. We didn't say much. We just handed him the flash drive and the small plastic bag. He held the bag up to the light, looking at the torn paper inside. He slid the flash drive into his computer and watched the video, his face impassive. When it was over, he clicked a few keys, ejecting the drive safely. He placed both the drive and the bag into a larger evidence envelope and sealed it. He wrote the date, time, and case number on the outside with a black marker. The entire process was methodical, official, and final. He looked at us, his expression firm. "We'll handle it from here," he said, the words carrying the full weight of the law. He walked us to the door of his office. As we were about to leave, he put a hand on my grandfather's shoulder. "Harold," he said, "I think our work here is almost done." He paused, a slight, knowing look in his eye. "You might want to make sure you're home on Thursday morning." Sheriff Callahan's words, "You might want to be home on Thursday morning," echoed in our ears for 2 days. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. We didn't know exactly what to expect, but we knew the final act of this strange drama was about to unfold. On Thursday, my grandfather woke up at his usual time. He made coffee, read the paper, and went about his morning routine with a quiet, unshakable calm. I, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. I kept checking the feed from the mailbox camera, even though there was nothing to see. The clock on the kitchen wall seemed to tick louder than usual. Then, at exactly 9:15 a.m., they arrived. 2 county sheriff's patrol cars, the same 2 that had rolled down this driveway weeks ago under a cloud of false accusations. But this time, the feeling was entirely different. There were no flashing lights, no sirens. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. My grandfather was standing by his mailbox, not with his deed or his tax receipts, but just standing there, a silent observer waiting for gravity to do its work. I stood on the porch, my phone recording, not out of fear, but to document the inevitable conclusion. The deputies parked their cars not in our driveway, but on the main road, right in front of Karen Driscoll's house across the street. We could see her through her large picture window. She was wearing a fluffy pink bathrobe and holding a mug, her face a mask of confusion. She clearly thought they were here for Harold again. She opened her front door and stepped out onto her porch, a self-satisfied smirk already forming on her face, ready to be the star witness in a show she had produced. But the deputies didn't look at our house. They walked straight up her manicured lawn. The senior officer, Sheriff Callahan, got out of his car and joined them. He was holding a single folded paper. Karen's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of bewilderment. "Can I help you, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice laced with that familiar, artificial sweetness. Callahan didn't answer right away. He simply unfolded the paper and held it up for her to read. A warrant. Her face went blank with shock. The color drained from her cheeks. The deputies moved past her, into her house, and came back out moments later with her purse and keys. One of the deputies, a woman, turned to Karen and spoke in a clear, professional voice. "Karen Driscoll, you are under arrest for forgery, filing a false report, and federal mail tampering." And then came the sound. It was a sound I had been waiting weeks to hear. The crisp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around her wrists. The sound of consequences. Karen finally snapped out of her shock, and the venom returned. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I am a respected member of this community. You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA." The desperate claim hung in the air, a pathetic last gasp for an authority she never truly had. Sheriff Callahan, who had been watching silently, took one step forward. He looked her directly in the eye, his expression not of anger, but of simple, irrefutable fact. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying across the quiet street, "you're not even on the board anymore." It was the kill shot. The final, devastating truth that erased her entire identity. The fight went out of her. Her shoulders slumped. Her reign was officially over. As the deputies led a now sobbing Karen to the patrol car, Sheriff Callahan turned his head and looked across the road at my grandfather. He didn't say a word. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then, he and the other deputy raised their hands and saluted him one last time. The next day, the front page of the local paper told the whole story in a bold, black headline. "Former HOA rep arrested for forgery, fraud, trespass." The article detailed her campaign of harassment, the forged documents, and the mail tampering, citing the video evidence we had provided. Her picture, a mugshot showing her puffy and tear-streaked, was right next to it. Justice wasn't just served, it was published. A week later, my grandfather hosted a community barbecue. He invited everyone on our road, even some of the members of the Lakeside Estates HOA. To my surprise, dozens of people showed up. One by one, they came up to my grandfather, shook his hand, and thanked him. One woman, an elderly neighbor from down the street, told him how Karen had tried to fine her $1,000 because her garden gnome was an unapproved color. A young couple told us how Karen had reported them to animal control, falsely claiming their dog barked all night. We weren't the only ones. We were just the only ones who fought back. My grandfather stood by his grill, flipping burgers, a quiet smile on his face. He had never wanted a fight, but when one came to his door, he had met it with patience, proof, and a steadfast belief in doing things the right way. As I looked around at the community he had inadvertently brought together, I thought about a phrase he used to say when he was working on a complex wiring project. A simple truth he applied to everything in life. You can't vote against gravity. It doesn't matter how loud you yell or how important you pretend to be. In the end, the truth always pulls you back to earth.